Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hold me in, behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in hell, you're there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me. Your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Amen. It's my favorite piece of scripture in all of the Bible. Psalm 139. And when I can say, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, and actually believe it, actually own it, not because I'm supposed to hear, but because I know it, that is Good Friday, Easter Sunday. And when I know that to be true of myself, it's true for every single person I encounter. That truth has been with me all week. I've been at the Vancouver School of Theology's Native Ministries Consortium. For those of you who don't know, I'm embarking on a master's degree. It was my first course. Oh my goodness, what a grueling pace. Classes from 8:30 till 5, 100 pages of reading at night, and a paper every night this week. Oh, I forgot what the classroom was like. I did it, all of that, in the context of an Indigenous community, the Native Ministries Consortium. I'm so grateful that the church requires its ministers to go back to school 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks a year, because I got to do that in this community. So who I was studying with were Indigenous people from northern Quebec, northern British Columbia, Indigenous people from Hawaii, Indigenous people from New Mexico, plus great white folks like me from other places too. An incredible experience. The course was 21st century theology in the context of an Indigenous experience. So there we were, having a dialogue between Indigenous theology, First Nations theology, and Christian theology. And what I discovered, and then what we had to do, one of the pieces we did was kind of look at the history of theology, what we say about God, the history of what we say about God, over kind of, we did a whirlwind tour of 2,000 years. And what we discovered that two things, the Enlightenment was really hard on the big questions of life where black and white thinking was introduced, right? The big questions of life got answered by the Age of Enlightenment, the modern world. Science could teach us, we didn't need God anymore because science could teach us everything. Well, we're past that now, and I'll tell you in a minute why, into the 21st century. And what we discover is the kinds of things and the kinds of ways of being we want theologians and faithful Christians are wanting to rediscover is actually not unlike the first century church. The first century church is kind of like, the other thing we discovered is kind of like Indigenous theology. It was remarkable. Two of the pieces that I want to kind of land with us today that were huge ahas for me. Two things. First, Quantum physics is teaching us that time is not linear. Science is proving that. So, that's true. First Nations people show up spatially, not linear. They show up in space. And with them is their ancestry. Major revelation in an intercultural Christian conversation and theology. So, we land on Paul today. We're going to explore Romans, right? And Paul, who is a mystic. Paul's hard to read if we think black and white. Right, wrong, good, bad. Paul's really difficult to read. Paul isn't there at all. Let's remember Paul is a first century Jewish theologian. Formed, as Judah said, formed in the Pharisaic order. He's Jewish. So, for Paul, the notion of sin is not a listing of all the things we do bad. For Paul, sin is a state of being. Marcus Borg writes that sin is to be in exile. What do we know about the exile? What do we know about the exile? They were hungry. They were separate from, they felt cut off. Their emotional state, their spiritual state was separate from God, outside of God. God was not present in exile. So, that's what sin is to Paul. It's not a judgment, and it's not a judgment of good or bad. It's, we're not in relationship with God. That's what sin is. We have to remember when we read Paul, that's what we're talking about. The other thing in this text is Paul is talking about sins of the flesh. And how many went to naked bodies right now? Honest, come on. How many went there? Right? Sins of the flesh. We see burlesque dancers shaking it, right? That's a modernist worldview. Flesh, according to the theology of Paul, was self-centeredness. Sins of the flesh were self-centeredness. Now, let me take this a little bit further. At Waves yesterday, we were gathered around the big coffee table in the upstairs place. The big square coffee table takes up a lot of room, and so we kind of are circled around it, squared around it. And I just said, Paul says, when you put yourself at the center, what do you put at the center? I kind of did this. All of a sudden, people were looking at the center. When we put ourselves at the center, those are sins of the flesh. What happens when we put ourselves at the center? We become focused on ourselves. The other piece for Paul that we need to remember is that Paul is equally, if not more so, interested in sins of the flesh as they affect us communally. Right? So the question, am I saved, is kind of an irrelevant question to Paul, because it's not about personal salvation. It's really important that we pay attention to our own practice, but Paul's really interested in sins of the flesh as they are encountered in the community. Right? Not what Stan did on Saturday night. Right? It's not about that. It's about what do we put at the center of the table? That's Paul's theology. That's what's going on in this. So when we hear sins of the flesh is death, well, think of it. What happens when we focus on, and we call these idolatries. We call this idolatry. What we put at the center of the table, our center of our focus. So think of the things that we might, so the right answer is what? Who, as Christian faithful people, who should be at the center? God. We can say that easily. But the reality of those words shows up in our living. Right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the quintessential, the most incisive theologian of the 20th century. Writing from a Nazi internment camp, run by Christians, church has lost its right to use the language of salvation in the community. Think that. Think of it. The church has lost the right to use the words of grace and salvation in the community because we'll put God at the center on Sunday. I remember Wendy Fletcher, our professor this week, she said, we'll put God at the center on our Sunday and we'll stick it to our neighbor on Monday. Right? And however we might say what that sticking to our neighbor is, it could be anything where we get to win. Right? Anything where we get to win. I get to be right. So there's where Bonhoeffer's coming from. Writing from a Nazi death camp run by Christians, he says the church has lost the right to use the language of salvation and grace in the community. We need to relearn it in our places where we gather. So we could put anything on that stool in the center of the community. What might we put there? Sometimes we put our health. We venerate and idolize our health. It becomes the center of our attention. Our families sometimes become the center of our focus. The one for the United Church of Canada is big right now. We put the future of the church at the center of our circle. That's what we've done. The future of the church is what we're focusing on. And what happens? God's over here somewhere. And that's what we focus on. So we focus on that. So what happens if we, okay, let's take all that off and put God here at the center of the table. Each of us, wonderfully, fearfully made. Each of us, putting God here. What happens? The psalmist says, I am fearfully, wonderfully made. Paul says, when you put, and Roar echoes that with the psalmist, right? Roar is echoing, how do we actually fix our humanity? We're really good at praying. We're really good at stuff, but how do we fix our humanity? Paul doesn't say do one over the other. Both are important. So the psalmist says, I'm fearfully, wonderfully made. Roar says, let's hang on to our humanity, pay attention to Jesus' humanity, who was what? The church asserts that Jesus was without sin. In Jewish theology, do you think Jesus didn't spit on the street or he didn't, right? Do you think he didn't do bad behavior? Of course he did. He was never out of relationship with God. He always had God at the center. And out of that, he grew, his humanity grew. So, each of us, fearfully, wonderfully made. So are the indigenous people that we worship. Fearfully, wonderfully made. And Paul says, put the Spirit in the center. Put God in the center. Put Christ in the center. What language you want to put on God, put that in the center. Everything else will take care of itself. That's pretty good news. Amen. Let's pray. Holy God, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Remind us that.